This is the last of class of the series, where we're going to find a conclusion, sort of, with the final rulings of the medieval authorities, right? So we, up until now, have only looked at the Talmudic sources. The Talmudic sources have painted a picture for us that I still have on the, whatever you call this thing, on the board next to me, and we'll go over that in a second. And this class, we're going to jump from the Talmudic sources to the rulings of the medieval authorities. What did they say about the sanctity of the Temple Mount? And we'll think a little bit about the repercussions of those conclusions and maybe what might be behind their rulings, what might be behind what they're trying to say. And then we will pick up again in the spring, around March, with a second part to this series, which expands the question from, so far, all we've really been looking at is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, but in the spring we'll expand and ask whether Israel and Jerusalem, the city, maintain a sacred special status today, and what is that dependent on? Now, you know that there are many laws in Judaism that apply specifically to the land of Israel. One of them is the tithes. We're going to see that today. The laws of tithing. You know, the laws of the corners of your field. All these are laws that specifically apply to the land of Israel. So it is an important question to ask whether we should be following these laws now, because what was sanctified as holy was the land itself, regardless of whether people lived there or not, or whether we're supposed to be waiting for some event in the future before Israel regains that status, right? This is a big issue, a big debate in Israel today. In Israel today, the debate focuses a lot on seventh-year produce. The law is in the Bible that in the seventh year, your fields must lie fallow, right? Now, that law was never suspended. The law just became inactive once once the Jewish people no longer lived in the land of Israel, right? And their fields were in who knows where, Ukraine. So the question is whether today, now that we're back in Israel, what do we do on the seventh year? We still know when the Shemitah year is. And there's a big debate in Israel as to what we should do with seventh year produce. Is it forbidden? Can I sell my field to a non-Jew and then eat the produce in the field? This is a big question that we're going to explore in the spring. Today, we're finishing up with the Temple Mount and its status. I want to remind everyone that all the opinions say that if you're going to rebuild the temple, the ideal place to do it is right there on the Temple Mount. What we're debating between the Talmudic sources is what the status is of that holy place where the temple once stood, and would I be permitted, if I don't have access to that place, to look at an alternative, right? It seems like maybe just a small issue, but we're going to talk about this at the end of the class, but I'm submitting to you that it's actually a huge issue with tremendous implications, and we'll get there in the course of today's class. So let me remind you of the three principal views that we looked at in the Talmud. Remember, I started off last class saying, I'm not happy with the way I presented last week's material. And last week's class, before that, I also said, I'm not happy with the way I presented last week's class material. Well, guess what? Finally, I'm happy with the way I presented last week's material. I am happy. I like the chart that I built here. Hopefully, it'll help us understand. Remember that in Devarim, last book of the Torah, right? There is a verse saying, sacrifices in whatever location is convenient for you are fine until you come to El ha-menucha ve'el ha-nachala. Are you all with me? The Bible says it will change when you come to the menucha and the nachala, the resting place and your inheritance. This verse is the focus of the Talmudic disagreement, because the people that we're looking at are trying to decide, when did that happen? Did it ever happen that we got to the menucha and nachala? And what happens if we're not there anymore? Right? What happens after we move on from the menucha and the nachala? So, remember, there is a disagreement over whether menucha and nachala means when you get to Shiloh, which is the place where the tabernacle stood before Jerusalem, before it was moved to Jerusalem by King Solomon, right? In the period of the judges, the tabernacle was at Shiloh. Or whether those words mean Jerusalem. Shiloh existed for a time, fell into disuse. So there was a period there where there was no official sanctuary. And then Jerusalem existed, and it also fell into disuse, was destroyed. And then there is still a period now where there is no sanctuary. But there were two periods where there was no sanctuary, right? One between the first and the second temple, and one now, right? After the temple's been destroyed. So we have three possible interpretations in the Talmud for menucha and nachala. The first anonymous source in the Talmud says menucha means Shiloh, nachala means Jerusalem. What is the implication of this view? That both sites, when they were fixed and established, had exclusivity. You with me? When Shiloh became Shiloh, it had exclusive rights over worship. When Jerusalem became Jerusalem, by that I mean when the temple was built, it had exclusivity. In the interim, it was a free-for-all. You could sacrifice wherever you want to, right? Now, then the question became, with that point of view, well, since it became a free-for-all between Shiloh and Jerusalem, since you could sacrifice wherever you wanted to, before the Jerusalem temple was built, but after the shrine in Shiloh stopped being used, does that mean that we can now sacrifice wherever we want to, right? If decommissioning a place means it's now no longer maintains that exclusivity, well, then we should be able to sacrifice now wherever we want to. And here you have two views on that question. One, ascribed to the Talmud and Tractate Zvachim. No. Jerusalem was different than Shiloh. Shiloh had exclusivity. Think of a contract. It had a contract with an expiration. The expiration of Shiloh was when it's no longer in use, when it no longer is around, then it loses its sanctity and therefore loses its exclusivity, and you can sacrifice wherever you want to. Jerusalem had a different contract. The contract made with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is not only will you have exclusive rights over the temple and all of its activities, no one else, no place else will ever again have the same right. So Jerusalem becomes the final resting place. With me? Even though we have Shiloh and Jerusalem as having exclusivity while they were around, Jerusalem is sort of the last step. It's not just a place of exclusive worship while it was around. It was the final resting place for the temple. Okay? There was another view found in Tractate Megillah ascribed to Rabbi Yitzchak that is much more controversial. And his view was, no, oh, look at that, Daniel, you made a nice little chart. That's wonderful. He's showing it on the Zoom now, a better graphic of my chart. Wow, why didn't you give me that? I would have handed it out. Okay, that's great. Oh, you have it too. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so this view in Tractate Megillah ascribed to Rabbi Yitzchak is, no, the contract that Jerusalem had was the same contract that Shiloh had. Shiloh had exclusivity, but only while it existed. And Jerusalem has exclusivity while it existed. And if it's no longer around, it is still a free-for-all. Right? We can sacrifice wherever we want to. Now, this is a very, very controversial view, and I'm giving something away now. This view in Tractate Megillah, this is the last we hear from such an opinion. We no longer hear anybody else. So the view is represented in the Talmud, but no later authority dares make that claim. And you understand what the claim is, right? No later authority dares make the claim that we can move on from Jerusalem, just like we moved on from Shiloh. One of the questions we're going to ask at the end of the class is why you think that is. Why is it that this view completely falls out of favor? Then, Rabbi Yishmael's view that the Torah referred in both instances to Shiloh. Menucha and Nachala were Shiloh. While it existed, it had exclusivity. After it was destroyed, you could have temples anywhere else you wanted. If you remember his statement, Rabbi Yishmael, he says, if you want to go to the temple of Onias in Egypt and make a sacrifice there, you would be able to. It was not a phony shrine. It was the real shrine. It was allowed to exist because Jerusalem never had exclusivity. It was just the main site of worship, not the only site of worship. Shiloh was the only place that had that claim. With me? And the most strict opinion is Rabbi Shimon, who says both cases, Nachala and Menucha, refer to Jerusalem, Shiloh never had exclusivity. Jerusalem was the only city that ever had an exclusive claim on sacrificial worship, and any other shrine that would have existed at that time would have been a pagan shrine or an idolatrous shrine, would have been forbidden. These are the different views that we saw expressed in the Talmud. Now, last week, I just want to remind everyone, one of the assertions made in the Talmud in Megillah on page 7 is that Rabbi Yitzchak changed his mind. You don't have to look it over, but we looked at it last week. You can review it. Rabbi Yitzchak, who said Jerusalem was not the final, but the most recent place where a temple could be built. The Talmud says he thought that at first, but then later he changed his mind. Someone challenged him and he recognized, you know what, you're right. Probably the biggest reason why this view is not cited anywhere after the Talmudic source. The biggest reason why nobody, no later authority picks up on this idea that you could have an alternative is because he changes his mind in the Talmud. Right? So the very guy who expressed that opinion is challenged by saying, you know, he didn't really say that, did he? Yes, he did, but then he changed his mind later. Okay, so now if one would make such a claim, you have nothing to rest it on. Even the Talmud rejects it as a possibility. Okay, so are we together? Since this view is rejected, since the view that Jerusalem could be anything else but the final resting place, everyone accepts that Jerusalem is the final resting place for the temple. What is really at the heart of the disagreement? Leaving this aside, what is going to be the main subject of disagreement that we are going to find the subject of debate in the medieval authorities? It's not going to be about whether I can make a temple in Nantucket. That has been settled. We're knocking him off. He changed his mind. The main subject of debate and dispute is going to be how we treat the Temple Mount today. How do we look at the Temple Mount today? Not whether we can build somewhere else. The answer to that question is no, you can't. If you're going to build, you have to build it on the Temple Mount. That's been settled. But is the Temple Mount today holy? Is it holy enough for me to ever compromise on in a political agreement? Is it holy enough that maybe I could go up there right now and sacrifice on that mountain? Is it holy enough that I can walk there? Am I allowed to walk on the Temple Mount? That's going to be the subject of disagreement between the medieval authorities. Let's look at the first of the medieval authorities. So we're dealing here with the sanctity of the Temple Mount. At the bottom of page 8, Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre is in Provence, I think, is a Tosafist. A Tosafist is a commentator to the Talmud. What is that noise? For this building?
Well, it's louder in the hall than it is in here.
You want to just find out? I don't, better to be safe than sorry. I don't smell anything. For those on Zoom, we're having a bit of there's an alarm here, it's a fire alarm, and we're just going to check to see if it's serious or not. We'll take a look. But I'm at the bottom of page 8. You see, it says after number 2, Ri of Dampierre. Okay, so I'm introducing the Ri of Dampierre. Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre lived in the 12th century in Provence. He's a Tosafist. A Tosafist is a commentary on the Talmud text that tries to smooth out contradictory opinions. Right? So he's going to be very important. What is his view in this example, in this text, on the sanctity of the Temple Mount? The bottom of page 8. Ri of Dampierre answered that the land, he's talking about the land of Israel. The land was clearly not eternally sacred with respect to tithes. So tithing, I mentioned earlier, is one of the special laws that applies to the land of Israel. When you're living in Israel, you have to tithe your produce. In one of my classes a few years ago, I went through the complicated way that people have to tithe. Part of it goes to the priests, part of it goes to the poor, part of it has to be eaten in Jerusalem. Basically, it's a tax on your produce. And if the land is eternally holy, then the laws of tithing apply in all political conditions. As long as you're on the land of Israel, you have to tithe. But the Ri of Dampierre's view is the land is not eternally holy. Yeah?
I think it's okay.
Okay. The land is not eternally holy. Its holiness is conditional. Conditional, based on other factors. It could be the conditionality of the land that, for instance, one opinion is most of the Jews of the world have to live there. If most of the Jews in the world live in Israel, then it's holy again. Another opinion is the temple has to be rebuilt. It's conditional, its holiness. It has to be re-sanctified. It was decommissioned, the laws suspended, and we are waiting some future event where the land can be re-sanctified, and at that time, the tithes will be reintroduced. This is a very important view. The Ri of Dampierre says the land is no longer holy. Okay, but the sanctity of Jerusalem and the temple is different. It is a sanctity conferred by walls. Now, this is really, really interesting. A sanctity conferred by walls. Last class, or it was the class before that, I forget, we talked about laws in Judaism that apply to walled cities. There are a few. The most famous is the law of reading the Megillah on Purim. There's a rule that if you're living in a walled city, since Shushan was a walled city in Persia, walled cities read the Megillah not on the 14th day of Adar, but on the next day. I think it's the 14th or the 15th. I don't remember. One of the day, not on the day that we say it's Purim in the calendar, but if you look at the calendar, it says Shushan Purim the day after. And if you were in Jerusalem, you would celebrate Purim the following day. There's special rules that apply to walled cities. And the Ri of Dampierre believes that the special rule for walled cities has an implication with regard to the sanctity of that space. Why? If you ask me, there is something about putting up a wall that makes for a permanent declaration, right? When you put up a fixed border, when you say that on standing over here, you're okay, but standing over here, you're not okay, and you mark it with some fixed line, there's some statement that you make that gives it a permanent, some sort of permanent resonance. If you don't put up a wall, if you don't have a border, so look at the reverse argument, right? The reverse argument is, if you don't put up a wall and you don't put up a border, it's not that important to you. Do you agree? This is my own thought of why the Ri of Dampierre takes this approach. He said Jerusalem was a walled city. Those walls around the city are not just there for decoration. They are there to designate the limits, the clear limits and boundaries of a holy city. And the Temple Mount, which is also walled, the walls are still there, is designed to do the same thing. It's to clearly display this is holy, sacred, and this side of the wall is not. Remember when we talked about the curtains? Remember when we talked about building the wall? The Ri looks at all of this and says, the physical walls matter. They do something that the mere declaration of this land is holy doesn't do. I think this is very, very true in life. The things you care about, you delineate properly. When I used to share the car with my sister, and we were in the back seat and we were fighting all the time, we had a rule. I put my hand down in the middle of the back seat. I said, this is my place. Like a mechitza. This is my place. That is your place. The things you care about, I know it's a silly example, but the things you care about defining as your own, you do clearly. And the only way to do that clearly when you're talking about physical space is to actually build something. Israel, the land of Israel, never was surrounded by a wall. But certain cities were, certain sites were. And conferring, by building those walls, you're conferring on that space a sacred status. And for the Ri, that makes all the difference. And so there are special rules for walled cities, because even those walled cities, outside the boundaries, we can clearly delineate secular and inside holy. No other city has that. People here, they say, I live in the GTA. What does that mean, the GTA? Could be an hour away and you're still in the GTA. Imagine if there was a wall that could clearly delineate what the GTA is and what the GTA is not. The presence of walls shows that this is a definition that really matters to you. And since we don't really care about the definition of the GTA, we don't build a wall or a boundary because it doesn't matter. We're not talking here about anything that has holiness, but when you are talking about something that has holiness, you build a wall. Jerusalem, we need to know where the boundaries of Jerusalem are. Why? Anyone know why? Why do we need to know where the boundaries of Jerusalem are? The tithe, the second tithe, which every few years is money that must be spent in Jerusalem. You don't remember this from the tithing laws? The tithing laws must be every few years. The second tithe, Maaser Sheni, has to be spent in Jerusalem. The special rule. Well, if I don't know where Jerusalem is, how am I, where the clear boundaries are? We're not talking about advice. We're talking about a Torah rule. The Torah says it has to be spent in Jerusalem. Well, if I don't know where the boundaries of Jerusalem are, how am I supposed to know if I've discharged my obligation or not? So according to the Ri of Dampierre, because we know where these walls were and these lines are, we can ascribe to them a sort of eternal importance. And that he gives to Jerusalem and to the temple. He calls it the sanctity conferred by walls, present at all times. He further said that we do not find any sage who says that the sanctity of the land with respect to tithes and all other land-dependent mitzvot during the Second Temple period was merely rabbinic and not of biblical force. What does he mean when he talks about what they did during the Second Temple time? This is important. The Second Temple, this is after the First Temple was destroyed, right? So a person might say, look, now that this First Temple was destroyed and Solomon's sanctification of the temple evaporated, right? So then all these things about tithes and where I can sacrifice, they're just rabbinic in nature. They're not biblical because Solomon's sanctification of the land was only temporary. So he says we don't find a single source that says that. Solomon's sanctification of those spaces was eternal. And the proof is that we don't have anybody who says that during the Second Temple period, the borders of where the temple was and where the city of Jerusalem was were disputed or contested or unclear. Everyone knew where Jerusalem was. Everyone knew where the temple was. Everyone knew those places had sanctity. Kidsha l'sha'ata v'kidsha la'atid lavo. They were sanctified during their time and sanctified for all time. And according to the Ri, that is final. So, Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre. Is the Temple Mount holy? You bet. Is Jerusalem holy? You bet. Is the land of Israel? No. The first thing he says is no, it's not. Because there's no wall. Well, there are different walls. There were, if you go and ask that question, they'll say, well, this one was made in the 8th century, and then this part was built later. So, and there was a wall in a different place and wall different. I think the wall that's you see now is Turkish. Wasn't it wrong? It's odd, but there was a different wall. There were different walls.
But these walls are much later than biblical times.
Yes, some of them are, some are not. Sure. If you go deep, actually, if you walk into the Zion Gate, is it the Zion Gate or no, it's the Jaffa Gate. The Jaffa Gate, and you look they've dug really down low. And you can see some of the walls that predate the 7th century, which was the first destruction of Jerusalem by the Assyrians. You can see where the original biblical walls were built around the city.
Are those the ones under the.
They're just very deep down because they've been built. Jerusalem is like a birthday cake. It's like a wedding cake. Yeah, and you can see some of the different places they were built. Now you can argue with the Rue d'Ampierre and say, well, which walls are the holy walls and which ones are the later ones, right? Do we follow the original walls or the later walls? It's not clear what he feels about that, but he ascribes to Jerusalem a sacred status and a sacred status to the Temple Mount on account of the fact that walls were built. I really like this source because I've always found the praying to a wall thing at the Western Wall to be a bit idolatrous and strange. But this is the first source that I've run across that actually ascribes something that I could relate to with regards to that wall. That wall is not just there to make the site look pretty. It wasn't just a retaining wall, as they called it. It was a delineating wall. It was a wall that said, beyond here, you walk on holy ground. And the idea of building that wall confers upon it a sacredness. When there's things we care about, we build a wall around it. We make sure to know the exact place where its holiness begins and ends, because it matters that much. And we wouldn't have done it if we weren't concerned with the holiness of that place. That is the view of the Ri. Okay. Now, the Rambam. Maimonides, you know a little bit more about, right? Spanish, Egyptian, another interpreter of the Talmud. The first source I give you, I don't have an English translation for, so I'll just translate it myself. It's from his Perush HaMishnah. That means his commentary on the Mishnah, not his major work, which is called the Mishnah Torah. His commentary on the Mishnah, he says as follows: Mina klalim hanechonim. Let's be clear, there is a correct thing to say, kedusha rishona, kedsha l'sha'ata, v'kedsha la'atid lavo. That there is such thing as sanctifying land for now and forever. Sanctifying it while it is in use and sanctifying it forever. We know those words. Kedsha l'sha'ata, v'kedsha la'atid lavo. V'kavanato b'kedusha rishona, kadosh shalema. When it was sanctified, it was given full, sacred, permanent, holy status. V'zeh b'mikdash bilvad muskam ledivrei hakol. And this, according to all opinions, agreed to all, was given to the temple. The temple was sanctified, that land, for its time and for all times. Aval bikdosh shar Eretz Yisrael yesh bo machloket. But when it comes to the rest of the land of Israel, there is a machloket. A machloket means a dispute. He knows that the Rue d'Ampierre disputed it. Ve'asmach beze al hakadosh Ezra vehi kedusha sheniya. The land was sanctified again by Ezra. Ezra, who's Ezra? Remember, he returns with the Babylonian exiles. So we're talking about the second temple now. It was sanctified first by King Solomon. It was sanctified again by Ezra when he returned with the Babylonian exiles in the year 586. 526. B'livrei hakol shekdusha shniya v'hi kol shehichaziku olei bavel kadsha l'sha'ata v'kadsha la'atid lavo. And let's remember definitely that Ezra, when he sanctified the land the second time after coming back with the Babylonian exiles, he also did it for its time and for all time. So Maimonides. Temple Mount. Is the Temple Mount eternally sacred? Yes. Jerusalem, he doesn't mention yet. Israel, he says, we don't know. He says, Yesh bo machloket. Now let's read in the English what he says, Maimonides, in the next two sources. This will be easier to follow along because I have the English translation. This is from the Mishnah Torah. Any area that was occupied by those coming out of Egypt and was sanctified by that first stage of sanctity lost its sanctity as soon as they were exiled. This is really interesting. Maimonides, for some reason, and I've tried to wrap my head around this, says that the initial sanctification of the land of Israel was weak. He says, when we came from Egypt and conquered the land of Israel in the time of the judges, right? And we conquered the land of Israel, it was a weak sort of sanctification. So when the Babylonians kicked us out, it lost its sanctity. For the initial sanctity, on account of it, being due to conquest alone, applied in its time, but not for all time. So Maimonides' view is that when when our ancestors came from Egypt, when our ancestors came from Egypt and conquested is not a verb. Conquered the land. They made it holy with a weak sort of holiness because it was on account of a war. They had to fight to get every piece of territory. So the concern wasn't really to live in the land, but it was to defeat the people who lived there, to have a dominion over the land, not to live there. But look what he says. This is the important part. Once the returning exiles came back and occupied it, and occupied some of the land, they sanctified it with a second stage of sanctity, which is eternal, both applying in its own time and for all time. So when the Babylonian exiles came back with Ezra, it was a different kind of return. Now there was no conquest. When the Babylonian exiles came back, there was no war, right? Who was it? It was the Persian ruler who now had kicked away the Babylonians and told the Jewish people who were living in Babylonia, you can go back if you want to, and you can rebuild, right? This is Cyrus, King Cyrus the Great. You can go back and rebuild. So that's what they did. And according to Maimonides, when they went back there, not to fight, not to conquer, but to dwell, to live there, that was a way of sanctifying the land eternally. Now we can have a really interesting discussion here about the difference between conquering the land and dwelling in the land. But I see a lot of parallels in this with contemporary debates on what indigenous peoples and imperialist countries, right? Whose land is this? Does it belong to the people who live here? Was it sanctified earlier? Does it belong to the first inhabitants? Does it matter if the desire was to conquer the land and enslave the people, or conquer the land and dwell there? For Maimonides, this does matter. Maimonides' view was, at first, their entry into the land after they left Egypt was not to dwell in the land. It was to conquer the land. That was their intention. We're fighting a war. We need to defeat our enemies and claim this land as our own. And for Maimonides, that's almost insufficient. It's not enough to gain control of a land by conquering it. You have to have a particular intention to dwell there. And he said that didn't happen until the Babylonian exiles came back. When they came back, their intention was to dwell in the land, and that is what sanctified it for all time. Not the wall, not the presence of a wall, which was Rie of Dampierre's view, but the intention of our ancestors to live, claim that land, to live in, that's what gives it its eternal sanctity. The returning exiles from Babylonia left unoccupied some of the areas that had been occupied by those coming out of Egypt, so that they would be exempt from tithes and the poor could rely on them during the sabbatical year. So this is another interesting piece that Maimonides says. When the first temple was around, we conquered all the land. But when the second temple was built, the returning exiles didn't conquer all the land or claim all the land. They did something very nice and gave a lot of land to the poor. That's what he's saying. A lot of the land was left to be given to the poor. Now, who cares about claiming it and not claiming it? Well, if the people had claimed the land and said, this land, let's say Tel Aviv, belongs to us, well, then all the produce would have had to been tithed. And what Maimonides said is they didn't want all that land to be tithed, to have it go to Jerusalem and have it eaten by all these people. They didn't want to think about it taxed. They wanted to keep Tel Aviv like we imagine, what's some offshore island? What island do people stash their money in? What's the name of it? Bahamas. They wanted to keep Tel Aviv like the Bahamas. A tax-free zone. Not so they wouldn't have to pay tax, but so the poor could walk around the Bahamas and just take what they needed. This is really interesting because Maimonides says the borders of the land are meant to be deliberately porous, right? So that the people can claim this land will tithe and this will be official land, but this land we're going to leave open to others and it will be unofficial. For Maimonides, there is a certain flexibility that's there that he does not believe exists for the Temple Mount. Right? And let's read the next source, which makes it clear that he does not believe that exists for the Temple Mount. The porousness, the flexibility. Tithes in our time, even in places that were occupied by those returning from Babylonia in the days of Ezra, are not of biblical force, but merely rabbinic. So tithing, we talked about the land of Israel. His ruling is tithing in the land of Israel is maybe by rabbinic. The most we can say is that it might be by rabbinic decree commanded. It's not biblical. The biblical command of tithing does not apply today to the land of Israel. It's only by rabbinic force. Why? Why? Why is it only rabbinic and not biblical? The Bible says when you're living in this land, you tithe. So now he explains, for there is no biblical tithing except in the land of Israel when all of Israel is there. as it says, when you come into the land, when all of you come, as was the case in the first inheritance, as will be in the case in the future during the third inheritance. So for Maimonides, we tithe, but it's not a biblically required, mandated tithe, because we're not all living in Israel. Only when we all live there, that's when the tithe has to be given. So this gives you more explanation about this question mark. But this was not how it was during the second, page 10. I'm on page 10. This is not how it was during the second inheritance under Ezra, when only some of them came, and therefore there is no biblical obligation. So during the time of the returning exiles from Babylonia, not everybody lived in the land, only some people. And because only some people lived there, not everybody, the tithes were only of rabbinic force, not of biblical force, which would be much stricter. Next source, bottom of page 10. Here's where we get to the real meat of the matter. Solomon's sanctification of the temple and, are you with me? And Jerusalem. Sanctified it in its own time and for all time. For him, Maimonides, it's not the wall that makes it holy. It's that Solomon, from day one, he may have said nothing about the rest of the land of Israel, but he did designate Jerusalem to be a holy city and the temple to be a holy place. Therefore, one can offer sacrifices even though there is no temple, and one can eat the most sacred item in the courtyard, even though it is destroyed and is not surrounded by a wall. And the less sacred items and Maser Sheni can be eaten throughout Jerusalem, even though there are no walls, for the initial sanctity applied in its own time and for all time. With me? Maimonides is the one who is to be blamed, if you want to blame somebody, for giving the Temple Mount its permanent sacred status. According to him, I could go up there right now and sacrifice my goat or whatever. Why do I say that with respect to the temple in Jerusalem, the initial sanctity applied in its own time and for all time, but with respect to the land of Israel, with respect to the sabbatical laws and tithes, it did not become sanctified for all time? Why do I feel there's a difference between the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and the rest of Israel? Because the rest of Israel, I'm willing to say that we can be flexible. But come on, God promised, it's in our parsha this week, this land to us and to our descendants. How can I be flexible with that land? Because the sanctity of the temple and of Jerusalem are an account of the divine presence, and that never lapses. Now Maimonides tells us where his theology comes from. It's not the fact that there's a wall. It's the fact that God's presence abides in that place even today. It never lapses. Behold, it says, I will destroy your sacred places. The sages said that even in their destruction, they are sacred. But the obligation of the land and sabbaticals and tithes is only because of its conquest. Once it was taken from them, the conquest lapses, and the biblical obligation of tithes and sabbatical years lapses as well, because it is no longer part of the land of Israel. For Maimonides, this is really important for understanding how can we compromise with the land of Israel? How could I give to the Palestinians Gaza? Well, because Gaza is not where God lives. And for Maimonides, the borders of the land of Israel are flexible. They can be wherever we say they are. The borders of the land of Israel are only sacred insofar as we choose them to be. It's only if I say, well, this is Jewish and that's not. but I have the flexibility to say that because that's exactly what Ezra did. When Ezra came back from Babylon, he says, I'll claim this city and this city, but Tel Aviv can stay Caribbean. Ezra played a little bit of a game to say this will be Holy Land and this will not be Holy Land. And we can do the same thing with the land of Israel. But unfortunately or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, you can't play that game with Jerusalem and with the Temple Mount. Why? Not because we don't have flexibility, not because we don't have walls, but because God's actually there. God is there. How can you give up a place where you believe God's presence actually resides? It is holy because of God's presence that lives there in some way. Therefore, whatever areas were occupied and sanctified by those who returned from Babylonia remain sacred until today, even though the land was taken from us, and it remains obligated in sabbatical years and tithes in the manner that we described in the laws of Truma on a rabbinical level. The flexibility that we have over the land of Israel is different than what we have with Jerusalem and with the Temple Mount. Now, he does say at the end, well, if the exiles coming back from Babylonia declared a certain place to be sacred, right? It should be sacred still today. But remember, only on rabbinic level, not on a biblical level. Not on a biblical level. For him, the biblical level of sanctity was never permanent. It was temporary. Only for Jerusalem and the Temple Mount do we have a sense of permanence. Now let's look at the last source. The Rambam is clear. The Ra'avad. You want me to move it over? Better that I move this over so that people online can see. Let's look at the Ra'avad, who loves to argue with Maimonides. This is his own opinion, he says on page 11. Who is this is his own opinion? Maimonides. The Ra'avad is the, let me give you his exact dates. Ra'avad, 1125 to 1198. Rabbi Avraham ben David, great commentator on the Talmud, regarded as the father of Kabbalah. Everyone who studies Maimonides knows that Ra'avad is from Provence. And when you study the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam, right, any works of Maimonides, you always have the Ra'avad's objections with you. It's called Hasagot HaRa'avad. The objections of the Ra'avad, or the commentaries of the Ra'avad, he comments on Maimonides all the time. So when he says this is his opinion, I know who his is. He's talking about Maimonides. And I'm not surprised he says this. He's saying this is the Rambam's opinion. What is his opinion? He's arguing with Rambam on the basis upon which Rambam declares the sanctity of the Temple Mount to be eternal. The Rambam says it's eternal. Why? Because God's presence lives there. But where is he getting that from? Right? Where does Maimonides learn that God's presence is eternal? So he quotes, because it says, I will destroy your sacred places. In the Torah, I will destroy your sacred places. Well, that means, according to Maimonides, that they're sacred even as I destroy them. And the Ra'avad says, give me a break. That's not, you're just saying that's what it means. But this is really your opinion. I don't know where he got it from. There are several places in the Mishnah that decree that sacred items should rot if there is no temple. In other words, he's having a hard time, the Ravad, squaring the fact with Maimonides, who just said, go up to the Temple Mount if you can and sacrifice there, even if there's no building, with the other sources in the Mishnah that say, unless there's a temple, let the tools of the temple, let the holy items of the temple, let them rot. He can't square both opinions. And the Gemara uses the concepts of the walls of Jerusalem having fallen to construct a case whereby Maaser Sheni cannot be eaten. So he also says, we learn, you're saying, and the Ridam Pierre says the walls matter, but you forgot something. The walls being destroyed matters too. You're right that the walls matter, but what about their destruction? And there are other sources that show us that when walls are destroyed, they don't matter anymore. And the case that he brings down is a case where Maaser Sheni, remember that's the tithes that must be eaten in Jerusalem. So he says, there's an example of the Talmud where someone says, so long as the walls of Jerusalem have fallen, one may not eat the second tithe there. So for the Ra'avad, Jerusalem is no longer a holy place because its walls have been destroyed. The walls don't exist anymore. And we can cite other cases where the wall's destruction has implications. Therefore, it is clear that according to the view that the initial sanctity not only applied in its own time, but for all time, there is no difference between the temple, Jerusalem, and the rest of the land of Israel. There we go. Thank you, Rabbi, for spelling it out for us very clearly. Is the Temple Mount sacred for all time? No. Is Jerusalem sacred for all time? No. Is the land of Israel sacred for all time? No. He says it. Moreover, even the view that says that the second stage of sanctification under Ezra, now he goes back to Maimonides who says, okay, look, it wasn't Solomon that made it holy for all time. It was Ezra and the returning Babylonian exiles who made it holy for all time. So even if you take that view, they only said it about the rest of the land of Israel, but not about Jerusalem and the temple. For Ezra knew that the temple and Jerusalem would one day be transformed and sanctified with a different kind of eternal sanctity through God's glory. Now the Ra'avad explains the fundamental disagreement between himself and the Rambam. The Rambam believes that God's presence is there. The Ravad believes that when the temple was destroyed, God's presence left. And when a third temple will be rebuilt, God's presence will return. So it has been revealed to me through God's counsel to those in awe. In other words, the Ravad, who just accused the Rambam of saying, I don't know where you're getting this from, now says, I'm getting my stuff from prophecy. I believe that God's not there because it's been revealed to me that that's the case. Therefore, one who enters the temple precincts today is not liable for spiritual excision, despite the fact that such a person is impure. Makes it clear. You walk on the Temple Mount today, it's fine. Can walk around. Nothing there makes it holy. It was when there was a temple there, but now that it's not, now that there's no temple there, it is not holy anymore. While the Ridam Pierre and the Rambam follow the views of who? The Talmud in Zvachim, that the Jerusalem sanctuary is the final resting place. It is holy for all time. You can't get away from that. The Ra'avad follows a different view, right? That Jerusalem, the view of Rabbi Yishmael, that Jerusalem's status can come and go. Now, it can't be replaced. That's important to stress. It can't be replaced. Can't build it somewhere else. Everyone agrees on that. The only cuckoo who believed in that was Rabbi Yitzchak, who later detracted his view that you could build the temple somewhere else. So let's not go that far to say that the Ra'avad thinks you can build a temple somewhere else. He still says it's going to be built there. But while it's not built there, it's just land. It's just land. It's no different than the rest of Israel. Okay, let's now, I'm turning the page. Let's now go behind the words. What do you think is motivating this discussion? What is motivating the disagreement, I should say, between the Rambam? The and the Rambam are the same, but the Ra'avad is very different. What did we see? First of all, we saw part of the debate was God's presence. Is God's presence there or not there? That's something they're arguing about. What else is behind the argument? What else are they fighting over? What's that? Tithing, right? Well, that's true. There are, in other words, practical concerns. I need to know right now whether I can walk there or not. I need to know right now whether I need to tithe or whether I don't need to tithe. In other words, there are real implications for these opinions, and I need to know who's right and who's wrong. Is the land holy like it was in the time of the Bible, or are we not there yet? What else is behind this? Yes. Yes, I think that's part of it, right? That's attached to this idea of God's presence. Is God's presence there even when the temple is not standing? Or do we have to wait until the temple stands again before we can say that it is a holy place? Yeah, then there's a disagreement, right? There are major implications to who is right and who is wrong in this discussion, right? If I say to you, God's presence is still on the mountain and will never, ever leave, because that's what Solomon decreed when he made the walls of Jerusalem, when he made the walls of the temple, they were imbued with some sacred status that will never go away. Where does that leave me? Pretty much with my hands tied, right? I can't ever give up that land. I can't ever find flexibility. And the very sight of other people stomping on the land or desecrating that land would, to me, be very offensive, right? So I think that's how we understand, through Maimonides' opinions, some of what we're seeing today in contemporary Israel with regards to the Temple Mount and its location, even on issues like the egalitarian kotel. If you strongly believe that women and men davening with Adam Mechitza is offensive, to do it right in front of the place where God's presence rests brings out fanaticism, because I have to defend, I have to guard against excessive frivolity, according to some, in front of the Temple Mount. Yeah.
But was there a biblical decree against men and women praying together?
But it doesn't matter. If I'm somebody who believes that that's not what God wants, and you're doing it right outside of God's bedroom, right? Well, but that's a different story. How do they know God? If I believe that that's what God wants, and I'm doing it right in front of God, I can become fanatic about stopping it from happening. I also think that there's something very dangerous about Maimonides' view that we should be offering the sacrifices, restoring worship on the Temple Mount, regardless of whether a temple stands there or not. Talk about fanaticism, right? So you see what's going to drive and what's going to motivate that point of view. That it's not about the building, it is about God's presence, which rests in that place and rests there eternally. Ra'avad sees things very differently. He would be no more offended about something inappropriate happening in front of the temple than happening in front of the supermarket a few cities over. For the Ra'avad, it's all the same. It's a chosen land. It's a special land to the Jewish people, but God's not there. God's presence is not there. It is holy because God chooses to make it holy, and God has chosen now not to make it holy, right? Not to dwell there in the way certainly that Maimonides thinks that God dwells there. Who's the bigger Zionist? Well, Maimonides is definitely the bigger Zionist, right? But Maimonides rests his opinion, according to the Ra'avad, on a very weak foundation. The Ra'avad says, well, how do you know that God's presence lives there? That's just your opinion, right? And the Ra'avad says, I don't think God's opinion does. And that's my opinion. What did I say? I don't think God's presence does rest there. And that's my opinion. So that to me is also what's really fascinating about how we're concluding this. We have two major authorities who say, this is my opinion. And they both say it to each other. They do quote some texts, but the texts they quote are all valid. So Maimonides says what Ra'avad says, that there are some texts here that I can choose that support my position. And the Ra'avad says, no, here are some texts that I can choose that support my position. And I think I'm right, and you think you're right. You know, that's a very difficult place to rest with such a crucially important site, the center of tremendous controversy in the world today, that basically all of Jewish opinion is resting on two guys yelling at each other for being right or wrong. These dueling views represent not only practical debates, but deeper questions on what it means to decommission sacred space. Our holy places, especially the most holy places, irrevocably marked with their sacred character, defining the architecture of our world for all time. Or does the tragedy of desecration allow the map of earlier ages to be wiped clean possibly opening up new possibilities for how sacred space is arranged. What are the benefits and the risks of each? When you say that a space is eternally sacred, the non-negotiability of that proclamation adds an intensity, doesn't it? To say that this place will not only be holy now, but will be holy for all time, there's an intensity there that you can't replicate. And if your goal is the eventual return to that sacred space, reestablishing it, the notion that that space has a sanctity that is eternal is very, very powerful. Why do we have to go back to Jerusalem? Because God is waiting for us there. God is there waiting. On the other hand, these sorts of formulations can imprison the religious mind and imprison the body in non-functioning structures that make it impossible to move on. If restoring the earlier regime is unwise or even dangerous, then the rhetoric of eternal sanctity can lead to a kind of religious recklessness that can be hard to control. This is at the heart of what we've been exploring since this class began. The tension between decommissioned space as sacred versus flexible, and the ability to appreciate and criticize both points of view is where I want to leave us. Not to say Maimonides is right or Ra'avad is right, but to understand what's at stake for them. And the one thing I would say is missing from this list that I just articulated is return. Return. For Rambam, the motivation to return, not just to dwell in the land of Israel, but to rebuild the temple, is just more intense, as I said. God's there. We're commanded to go back there and perform our rituals. We need to do it. The Ra'avad is, his theology is much less intense. For him, there will be a time when we'll rebuild the temple, but it'll happen when it'll happen. And it's not like we should be treating that space as any more sacred than any other space in the land of Israel. And I think manifestations of both of these points of view have presented themselves throughout Jewish history. The big debate that I think we need to confront is a debate of how urgent it is that the situation in Jerusalem changes. By situation, I mean maybe giving part of the land to the Palestinians, maybe re-establishing some sort of central synagogue on the site of the Temple Mount, claiming the Temple Mount of our own. I mean, this is all about how urgent we are supposed to act in returning there. So one point of view is much more, I think, intense about that return than another. Okay, final thoughts and comments? Go ahead. Oh, I'm over time. Sorry. Yes.
It's just that in an earlier class, we learned about this fellow Yahuwah, and he said that what he said was the law, and that he believes what Rambam says, that here I have it. I've heard a tradition that sacrifices can be offered on the Temple Mount, even in the absence of a temple. One can eat the most sacred items. So You said at that point that that's the law.
Everyone accepts the view of Rabbi Yehoshua
When did
that you can go, is Mishneh, 2nd century. Everyone accepts the view of Rabbi Yehoshua that you could go up to the temple, that you can go up to the Temple Mount and offer sacrifices there. Nobody disagrees with him in the Mishnah, which makes, where is it? The Ra'avad's point of view particularly challenging, because out of nowhere, 1,000 years later, he says it's not true. This is all about whether God is there or not. Which, if you think about it, makes sense. Why do I care does God care where I sacrifice? Only if there's some place that God prefers. But God has made the whole world. Why does God care if I make my barbecue in Cincinnati versus Jerusalem? Right? It only matters if we believe there's some aspect of God that's there in Jerusalem waiting for that site to be reopened or recommissioned. And for Rabbi Yehoshua, absolutely. It's God is there waiting. Yes.
Like they intimate that Israel has a monopoly on God's presence, and the rest of the diaspora doesn't have that.
I would be careful with that. I would say that according to Maimonides, it's not that Israel has a claim on God's presence. It's that the Temple Mount, God still has some association there. Jerusalem and the rest of the land of Israel were made holy by Ezra and the exiles, right? That's what Maimonides says. They made that land holy. They gave it that special status, and it's permanent. Now, whether we have to tithe or not is disputed. He says it's rabbinic and not biblical. Right? And the Ra'avad would say, no, it's all holy, but not because of God's presence. Not because God is there, but because that land it's because of a historical, let's put it that way, a historical connection. History makes it sacred.
That leaves the diaspora.
Not as holy as Israel. But he does not address the question of whether God's presence exists in Israel in any more fundamental a way than it does in the diaspora. My guess is he would say no. That this isn't about God. It's about land that was declared l'sha'ata and la'atid lavo, holy for its time and holy for all other time. And that decree was made over the land of Israel and over Jerusalem and over the temple, but it wasn't made in the diaspora. All right. Thank you, everyone. So this ends the series. We pick up again for part 2 in the spring. I will let you know when. And at that point, we're going to look at Jerusalem and the land of Israel. We started looking at it a little bit, but there's much more to say about the land of Israel retaining its holiness. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, everyone on Zoom. And thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Rabbi.